Welcome, everybody, to our caregiving educational series, When You Care. Just know that although we aren't together in the same room, I know it's not quite the same, but I'm sending you a very warm welcome through cyberspace, a virtual hug. And I'm very honored that you're taking a little bit of time to explore some of the important topics related to the journey of caregiving, actually to the journey of life. And I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to the CSU Extension Group. It is a delight to work with Ginger and Ellis and Allie. Sue Schneider was my initial contact, and it's just been such a wonderful gift this year to extend my efforts into this community and to have this platform. So thank you so very much. Now, as Ginger noted, my name is Jane Barton. My company is Cardinal, and I serve as an educational consultant, which means I get to do what I love every single day. I serve as a speaker, a writer, and/or a listener, and I focus on the topics that I'm passionate about: aging, end-of-life care, and caregiving. Now, in the handout that will be posted, hopefully in the chat feature a bit later, and also available to you after the program is over, you can read about my somewhat curious career path if you choose to. But most recently, I have a background in hospice and palliative care. So I served as a chaplain as well as a community educator. But I think of greater relevance to what I do today is my personal story. That really is my motivating factor. I was called to care for my mom when I was 15. She was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer, and my family and I gathered around and cared for mom until she died 8.5 years later. And in that journey, I think one of the main learnings for me was that knowledge is power, and without it, life can be pretty darn scary. And so every time I speak, every time I write today, I hope to share something of benefit with you, the audience, that will fill in some of the gaps of your knowledge, maybe a new insight, maybe a new resource, maybe a new concept, so that when you're challenged by aging or the journey of caregiving, you can then make informed choices instead of merely reacting out of fear, because that never serves us well. And that is my mission today. It's my hope, it's my goal, that you will hear something of importance when we talk about your final act. We are actually going to delve into a countercultural conversation talking about death and talking about funerals and end-of-life rituals and how they serve us. So I applaud you for finding the courage to be present today and to explore this subject. And for the time that we have together, let's have a heartfelt chat about the following things. First, I'm going to encourage you to imagine your final act. Now, that's not something we do naturally in our country because we are death averse. We're age denying. We don't want to go there. So most people don't have a plan. They haven't scripted their final act. So I want to motivate you to do so by then exploring the whys of end-of-life rituals. How do they serve us? Why should we bother with them? Why should we invest our time and attention to crafting such a scenario? Once I woo you over to my side, believing that it is worth our while to do this, then we will talk about the who, the what, and the where of your end-of-life ritual. And we'll conclude by talking about how to create and conduct a ritual that will serve those that you leave behind, those that you love the most. It will serve them incredibly well, and it will ultimately be a priceless gift that you leave to them. So let's begin with a question. Have you ever wondered about your final act? Have you had a moment of reflection when you are thinking down the road and wondering, wonder what that would be like, and what do I imagine that to be? Have you thought about the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how of it? Well, if you have you shared those musings with other people, with people who will actually enact your final act, your family and your friends? Have you chatted about it? Well, if you haven't, please hear this message, because I am passionate about this. This is an opportunity not to be missed. In fact, you could view it as a once in a lifetime opportunity. It is so vitally important for you, your family, and your friends. And I'm passionate about it because of the lessons I have learned over the course of my 66 years here on Earth. And I learned these lessons starting at the age of 15, when my life changed forever. I learned that when my mom died, that some sort of script is a gift. It's a priceless gift. And it gives us a few guardrails and signs that are pointing us in a direction as to what the person might have wanted. Now, reflecting on my own family experience, when my mom died, I was 24 years old. And this was my first significant death. And because we were so paralyzed by fear, we never talked about that eventuality. So we were left in the dark as far as what she wanted as far as an end-of-life ritual. Our fear of death precluded that planning process. For 8.5 years, we danced around the elephant in the room, trying to ignore it, that overwhelming presence that this was a terminal condition. And that didn't serve us well. Because ultimately, when my mom died, my dad was so overcome by his sorrow and his pain, he just wanted to get through it. And he did it in the most efficient way possible. And it was a blur. And most of us, my family, we weren't even involved in the planning process. And it dramatically impacted my grief and mourning process from that day forward. It did not serve us well. Now, fast forward to my experience with my dad, reflecting on his ultimate demise. That was very different because it occurred about 18 years later. So I was older for sure and a wee bit wiser. And my brother and I tag teamed. We combined our efforts and we talked about how we needed a plan. We learned a lot from the experience of our mother's death. Now, we tried to talk to our father before he died about what he would want, but our father was very private and he didn't want to go there. And he basically just said, throw a party. I don't need anything else. Don't waste the money. Well, we honored his one request for a party. But Richard and I recognized we needed something more to help us integrate that loss into our lives. And so we planned for a year before our father died. We met with a funeral director. We put some plans in place. We had an idea of what would serve us well. And it made all the difference in the world. Because once our dad died, we had a supportive community that came together to honor his life and to support us as well. So very dramatically different experiences that reinforce my belief that the final act makes a huge difference, and it is definitely worth the bother. So learn from my family. You don't need to engage in the experiences I did to learn these very hard lessons. I'm happy to share them with you. And hopefully you'll be motivated to be a wee bit more proactive than we were and much more courageous. You can confront your fears around death and dying. And once you do so, it actually frees you to live more intentionally and more fully. So gather together, script your final act, pose questions, debate different options, creatively collaborate. It will serve everyone well. Now, if you need some motivation, let's understand why ritual is important, ritual in general. And then we will focus specifically on end-of-life ritual. How does it serve us? Let's look at the whys of ritual to understand this. During uncertain times, ritual is actually a beacon in the night. It is a guiding light for us because ritual by its very nature guides us through trying times. Thomas Long, who is a known expert on Christian rituals, describes it in this way. Rituals are ordered events, and they are often performed in times of upheaval and disorder so that order may be brought to chaos. Now, part of being human, inherently, we like a little bit of structure. We like order and continuity, and we love our sense of normalcy. But in the aftermath of significant change, we are thrown into a time of transition, which can be incredibly turbulent. And we don't like chaos. We don't like uncertainty and the unknowing. And that is definitely where we are in the aftermath of death. And that's why end-of-life rituals are so vitally important. Ritual helps to calm the seas, to reduce our anxiety, to mitigate some of our fears, because ritual gives us a sense of order, of continuity, maybe even a little bit of control. So this all sounds fabulous, right? So what is ritual? Well, I researched ritual for several years when I first started doing community programs. And it's not a term or a concept you can succinctly define because it comes in so many varieties. Ritual can be secular or sacred. It can be long or short, complex or simple, individual or communal. I think you get my point. There is not one definition that seemingly applies to all forms of ritual. But I think I'm safe in saying this. Ritual, you know it when you see it, and you definitely know it when you feel it. Because ritual is not rote, it is not routine. Ritual is extraordinary, and it touches our hearts and it resonates in our bones. It's a significant experience. And so intuitively, we recognize it. Thomas More, who is another expert on ritual, defines it in this way. Ritual is any action that speaks to the soul and to the deep imagination. Even the smallest rites of everyday existence are important to the soul. So let me share a story with you that will distinguish ritual from routine and give you a better understanding of this concept. So every day, I begin by walking down the stairs, going into my kitchen, and making a cup of hot tea. And it's very simple. Fill up a cup, nuke it, throw a tea bag in, let it steep for a few minutes, and then I get caffeine into this body. That is my morning routine. Now, about once a quarter, I go through a ritual of making a very special pot of hot tea. And I will go into my kitchen and I will pull out a very special China teapot and a China tea cup. And I will only brew constant comment tea because that was my mom's favorite tea. And as that pot steeps, I smell that characteristic fragrance of spices and oranges. And I'm transported back in time to my childhood home. And I'm sitting across the table from my mom in the kitchen, and we're just chatting about life. And we did that every day when I got home from school. That is ritual because I do it with an intention. I brew that special pot of tea when I miss my mom the most, when I want to feel at home, when I need a sense of her presence. I do it intentionally. So ritual is so different than routine because ritual frames ordinary time as extraordinary time. It's significant. And when we ritualize something, it serves as a conduit for connection. We can actually perceive ritual as this huge carabiner in life that serves to connect us to that which is beyond ourselves. It connects us to ideas and concepts, to a sense of the sacred and the divine, to memories of loved ones, to nature, also to meaning and purpose. It is vitally important for these connections. And these connections prompt a sense of order, healing, integration, understanding, transformation, and creation of community if we ritualize with other people. Ritual also satisfies our hunger for the familiar. Remember, I said in the aftermath of significant change, it's a time of turbulent transition where nothing seems ordinary or normal. And so we feel as if we're a little bit off kilter. Nothing seems familiar. Well, if we engage in a ritual perhaps that we have practiced and conducted for years, if not decades, that process is ingrained at the cellular level. We could do it with our eyes shut. And so by engaging in that ritual, it gives us that sense of control, of predictability, of continuity. And isn't that what we long for when life is chaotic and uncertain? Isn't that the rope we are reaching for? That port in the storm, the anchor that will again give us a sense of continuity and certainty? I think so. We can also think of ritual in this way. Ritual is recognizing a life change, any significant life change, and then doing something to honor and to support that change. So it could be a ritual that honors the birth of a child or the death of a loved one. It could be a secular ritual, such as a celebration of graduation, or maybe the marriage of two individuals. Again, ritual comes in all shapes and sizes. But regardless of the specifics of a ritual, they give us a sense of structure, a framework within which to live and to navigate times of change and uncertainty. Ritual is what the columnist David Brooks calls social architecture that marks and defines life's phases and its various stages in life. Another attribute of ritual that is key is that it is meaningful. Again, we don't do it purely by rote. We do it with intention. And the hope is a ritual will help us to make sense of our situation. So ritual is meaningful. It's not mindless. It's not just something we do day in and day out. In The Lost Art of Dying, the author describes it in this way. Ritual does not exist for its own sake, but to establish order during rites of passage and major life disruptions by pointing toward a truth, a meaning worth pursuing and animating community members to respond to that truth. Now, also through ritual, meaning is discerned and expressed through symbolic gestures and symbolic elements. So a major aspect of any ritual that you engage in is there are going to be symbols that are meaningful to you. Now, symbolic elements of ritual, there's no set formula, because an object that may contain tremendous meaning for you is of little significance to me. It just depends on our own personal lived experience and our relationship to that particular object. So what makes a symbol a symbol? Well, symbols stand for something that is unknown and sometimes cannot be made clear or precise. The purpose of a symbol is to communicate meaning. And sometimes that communication is necessary because we just can't find the words to express what we're feeling or thinking. And that's when symbols are so powerful. Remember the old adage, an image is worth 1,000 words? Absolutely. Symbols represent that which cannot be easily expressed. So such as a cross, the Star of David as far as religious symbols, or a rosary, prayer beads, or a mala. You have a connection, perhaps, to some of those symbols that mean something uniquely to you, predicated on your history to that particular object. So symbols represent something else. They convey ideas and beliefs. Now, I invite you to contemplate in your own lived experience what symbols are meaningful to you. And perhaps some of these symbols you would like to incorporate into the script of your final act. Obviously, cardinals are meaningful to me. It's the name of my company, and typically I will pepper a few red birds throughout most of the programs that I present, and you may be wondering why. Well, it's because the red bird, the cardinal, represents the spirit of my mother. Now, she was raised in Ohio. Cardinals are the state bird. and she absolutely adored them. She loved their song, and the arrival of cardinals in our backyard when I was growing up in West Texas heralded the coming of spring. But even more important to that, when I was despondent and despairing and grieving, without fail, a cardinal would appear. And I would remember, okay, mom's not physically here, but she's ever present spiritually. And so this is a symbol that persists in my life and will until the day that I die. It is meaningful, and it helps me oftentimes to make sense of some very difficult situations. I'm never alone. I can handle it. So ritual, it's one way to structure and interpret the world in which we live. And during the times that try our souls, they are vitally important because ritual pulls the pieces together. It's that carabiner in life that helps us to connect, and it transforms our lived experience. I think Anderson does a phenomenal job in her book of kind of condensing everything down into this statement. Rituals can help us see things in a clearer way. If we use the symbols to help illuminate what is going on around us, a difficult situation becomes easier to accept and move through. The symbols help us give names to those feelings, and the rituals help carry us beyond the situation to a higher understanding. They transform. So conducting, engaging, participating in ritual transforms a time and a space. It transforms our understanding and perception of life. It transforms us. So vitally important to integrate this into life. And that is particularly true when it comes to end-of-life rituals. Why are they so important? Well, let's focus specifically on this kind of ritual for the remainder of our time today. What are the whys of end-of-life rituals, whether it's a funeral, a memorial service, a celebration of life, or even if you throw a big party like my dad wanted? Well, the whys are numerous. First, a ritual at the end of life, it provides the last rite of passage, recognizing something of significance has happened. Someone has died. So it reinforces the reality of the death of that person. It is also the first step to initiate our mourning process. We grieve inwardly and we grieve mightily, but we process that grief outwardly by mourning. And so a funeral, a memorial service, that gives us the opportunity to declare to the world, I'm hurting. I lost someone that I loved, and I also need your support. So it invites other people to participate in that ritual. And when gathered together, it stimulates stories of the person who died. And so those narratives are told over and over again, helping us to learn how to integrate loss into life. These rituals also validate a life lived, and it allows that community participation. And this provides comfort for those left behind, the bereaved. It begins the process of integration, and it helps in the discernment of meaning, making not only sense of the death of a person, but more importantly, making sense of their life. These rituals also are very important in affirming the social order, meaning that life will go on. Remember, in times of transition, we're stuck between what was and what will be. And many of us mired in grief and mourning, sometimes we have difficulty moving on. But with a ritual, having that community, we're assured that we're moving toward a new beginning, a new normal, and we're not alone in that process. These rituals also acknowledge the reality of our own mortality. When we witness the death of another, we're honoring the life of another. We can't help but contemplate the fact that ultimately we will all die, And that's not a bad thing, because when we recognize that we're not guaranteed anything beyond this moment, we have a tendency to live more intentionally, to live with a greater sense of gratitude. And that is a good thing indeed, my friends. And the last 2 points, when engaging in end-of-life rituals, it changes the identity of the living to dead, the person who died, and it transforms the bereaved to survivors. So a multifaceted beneficial approach to dealing with the death of someone that we love and someone that we know. And since we hunger for connection and clarity in the aftermath of death, what better thing than ritual? End-of-life rituals serve as that guiding light to illuminate the path forward toward a future that has greater certainty, toward a future where we long for stability and normalcy, a future where we can reconnect with life. Now, understanding the benefits of end-of-life rituals specifically, let's contemplate your final act. How will you craft it? How will you write it? What are the who, the what, and the wheres of your final act? Well, let me give you some things to consider for your script. And I'm going to do this by asking you some questions and sharing some information with you for your consideration. First, when you are thinking about your final act, do you want to provide a comprehensive, complete script or merely an outline? Now, if you look at the experts in the field of ritual, you're going to hear voices from both camps. Some people think we should be very comprehensive and give the final draft to our family that will be left behind, and then they just follow it step by step. Others suggest a basic outline, and then the family can kind of fill in the gaps with things that will serve them well. It's your choice, whatever you opt to do, but you need to think about this intentionally. Another question: what is your preference around the disposition of the body? This is a big question in this day and time because we have so many options. And I'm going to run through some of these options because some you probably have never heard of. And if you're interested, you need to do a little bit of investigation to see if these options are available in your community. So for many people, the traditional burial is the preference for the final act. Now, that would include a cemetery plot. Now, your family may own a plot already, or perhaps you've already bought one, but just realize this can be incredibly expensive. So you don't want to have sticker shock. You want to make sure you understand what that investment would be. But there are some communities in which a cemetery plot may be $20,000. So you want to make sure that you're prepared for that, that you're planning for that. Now, also associated with a traditional burial will be the cost of a vault. That will be included in the overall cost, as well as a container. Now, coffins, this is a term that is used for a very simple container. No bells or whistles, but it serves the purpose. Or perhaps you are inclined to investigate a casket, which is much more ornate and much more expensive. Now, I hesitate to throw a figure out there as to how much this will cost, but assume it's going to start around $2,500 and it's going to go up from there. Another interesting twist to this aspect of a traditional burial is you can now buy caskets online. So you can check out Amazon, or you can go to a big box store like Costco. And based on my recent research, you can save about $1,000, maybe even $1,200 on this expense. But again, that's going to take some forethought, a little bit of planning. Now, if you're going for a traditional burial related to that process and also your service, you may want to chat with your family about whether a viewing is something that you would want to write into your script. Now, I grew up in the South. You probably hear my twang from time to time. And this was very customary when I was growing up. Viewings are not expected today. It's not to say you can't have one, but it's an option. If you live in the South, again, this is going to be customary, but this is something that you need to contemplate whether that's going to be a benefit to those that you leave behind. Now, if you want a burial, but you want to be more environmentally conscious, there is something called green burial today. And the green difference is that you would purchase a biodegradable casket. There would be no vault or grave liner, no embalming, and there is minimal environmental impact. It's a little bit less expensive, again, depending on where you live, but this is an option that many people are going for with concerns about our environment. Some other aspects that perhaps you've never thought about is your preferred clothing for burial if you opt for a traditional or green burial. Now, I encountered this question when my mom died. And again, I was 24 years old. I was in absolute shock. I was totally distraught emotionally, as was my father and brother. But my dad said, okay, Jane, you need to go home and pick out clothes for your mother and take it to the funeral home. And I was like, okay. So I get to the house and I open the door to my mom's closet, and I didn't have any clue what to do. And I looked at the end of the closet, and there were a few dresses hanging there. My mom was not a great fan of dresses. I guess I inherited that from her. And then I thought, how do you decide on this? And so I just sat down and I had a moment where I basically fell apart emotionally. And then I had this image of my mother pop into my heart and into my mind, how I imagined her. And it was in her favorite t-shirt, wearing her beloved 501 Levi's, wearing her Keds sneakers. That was my mom. So I thought, okay, that's how I'm sending you off. And that's what I took to the funeral home. Now, I didn't ask anybody's permission on this, but when I told my dad and my brother, they both just broke out into a huge grin and said, the best thing you could have done. I was glad for their response. But again, it's have the conversation before, so it's not an emotional train wreck for the person you leave behind that's making that decision for you. Another thing that needs to be considered is jewelry. Are there things in your jewelry case that you want to be buried with, or would you prefer to bequeath those to someone in your family? Now, again, I've heard arguments from both sides of the fence, but I know in my own family with my godparents, this was a big issue. My godfather died. I was probably in my early 20s, and they had no children. And when he died, my godmother was an emotional wreck, and we got through the service. And about 2 months later, she received a phone call from an extended family member on my godfather's side. And this person was asking my godmother what she'd done with the family signet ring. And she's like, what? Oh, you know, he wore it all the time. And we always pass that to the next generation. Well, my godmother had totally forgotten about that. So my godfather evidently was buried with that ring. Now, the other family members were so angry, they threatened to exhume his body. Thank goodness that did not happen. But again, have the conversation well in advance so you can avoid that particular conversation in your family. Now, some other options around disposition of the body. Cremation is very common today and very popular for a variety of reasons. Some people think it's more environmentally friendly. It's more cost effective. Again, it's not going to be as expensive as a burial because you don't have the plot. On average, I've put some figures in your handout for all of these options we're going through. Cremation is going to start around $3,000, and that's just a basic cremation. Doesn't include services or death certificates or anything like that. Compare that to a traditional burial running $8,000 to $10,000. So there is a cost savings there. Now with cremation, there are two varieties available today. There's fire cremation, which many people are not as in favor of recently because of the environmental impact of that. So some folks are opting for water cremation. Now, if you're interested in this option, contact your local funeral homes to see if it's even available, because some funeral service providers do not offer this option. And again, check on the pricing. The averages are noted in your handout. Just know that in Colorado, most of those costs are going to be a little bit higher. Now, other ideas on disposition. Well, yes, there are. And if you are curious about it, I refer you to a website. Go to funeralocity.com, and they will give you information on all of these different options, also included in your handout, such as a seedling urn, a memorial wreath, the process of having a home funeral, a body donation, sky burials, space burials, burial at sea. Now, some of these may sound beyond belief, but they're possible. Some of them are a little bit pricey, but it just depends what fits into your final act. Some other ideas that are recently available in Colorado is a process called terramation, sometimes referred to as natural reduction. Basically, this is human composting, and there are only 3 states in which this has been legally authorized. There's Washington, Colorado, and there's one other. It might be Oregon. I'd have to double check on that. But again, it's not going to be available everywhere throughout the state of Colorado, so you need to do some research if this is something that you are interested in. Memorial forests are scattered all over our country today, where you can buy a memorial tree where your cremains will be buried at the base of that tree, and then you will have a plaque that would be attached to the tree. So your family would have a lovely environment to go visit you, to remember, to honor you for years to come. Now, price tags, oftentimes this may be the determining factor for you as far as what you want to include as far as your preferences. Again, I noted the resource of funeralocity.com and then also the handout. This will be a good starting point for you. But realize you can call your local funeral home, and by law, they have to disclose to you their price list. And many of them actually post their prices online. So there are ways for you to get that particular information very quickly. So a lot of options worthy of your consideration related to the question of your preference regarding disposition. Now, some other things to consider for your final act. What are your preferences around the service to be conducted? Well, you could opt for a funeral where the cremains or your body would be present. You could opt for a memorial service, so that could be done at a later date, and the cremains and the body would be absent. You could go for a celebration of life or just a full-blown party, or a combination of all the above. But the elements of importance take into account your cultural norms, your religious norms, and your family norms, and also take into account the people that you're writing this final act for. What would resonate with them? Who will be there? Imagine this, your final act. Do you have a celebrant in mind, a eulogist? Do you have certain people in your family you would love to have speak about the life that you lived? Pallbearers, ushers, who would you invite to be part of that service? Would it be restricted? Would it be open to the community? Do you have a funeral director or a funeral service provider in mind? What about caterers and musicians or soloists? Lots to consider, right? And where will the service be held? Do you want it in a faith community? Do you want it out in nature, in your home, in a vacation spot that was important to your family? All of those options are possible. And what are the key ingredients to your service? Do you have a particular reading from a favorite book, maybe some scripture? Are there stories related to your family that you want to make sure are part of that conversation? Do you have a particular song to be included? What about food and drink? This could be a cultural norm, or maybe foods that were your favorites, or a particular drink that folks associated with you, like the constant comment tea that I had for my mom. What's your favorite flower? What pictures might you have on easels around? And what about videos? So many things to consider, including offering virtual options for individuals that can't make it to the service. And that could be because they live halfway around the world and logistically it makes no sense. Or perhaps physically they're unable to ambulate and it would be difficult to be on site for the service. There are many funeral service providers that offer live streaming, or they would videotape the service for viewing at a later date. Maybe you could Zoom people in, I don't know. But today, with all of the technology, it matters not where you are, you could still participate in that particular ritual that could be meaningful. Now, if you opt for scattering, if you are opting for cremation, either fire or water, consider having a service. Would the scattering follow immediately, or would that happen at a later date? And what location would you desire to have your cremains scattered? Now, in my community of friends, we've actually had conversations about a lot of this. And people know that I choose to be cremated. And when I was chatting with my group of friends, they said, okay, so where do you want us to scatter you if you predecease us? And I said, well, I'm going to make you work at this because I have 3 spots and I'm going to be moving them around all over the Western US. So it's going to be kind of a road trip for them. And we laugh about this, and then we get a little teary-eyed. And so it is that bittersweet moment of reflecting on life and understanding it's going to be hard for them. But what gives me comfort is I know they're going to do it together. So that helps me in the process of planning. So as you move through all of these considerations, if you take the time to contemplate the questions and the resources that I present today, once you've settled kind of on your own script, then have the conversation with the people that will enact your final act. Talk to your family and your friends. Document the preferences because memories tend to fade. So write it down so they can refer to it at a later date. And you may even want to be so proactive as to write your own obituary. Now, I've talked to some people recently and we were chatting about this subject and they thought, well, that seems kind of morbid. And I said, well, actually, it can be a great gift to families and friends because they may not know some information that you want included. In fact, I was talking to a family recently, and it was after the death of a beloved father. And one of the adult children was asked to write the obituary. And he said, to be honest, I don't know exactly where my dad was born. And so he was having to go through a lot of effort to find a birth certificate or talk to other family members. And it was really stressing him out. So maybe even if you don't write the obituary, you provide them with the needed information. And you should also contemplate and consider maybe prepaying for your funeral plans. This is called a pre-need insurance policy. You can fund it in a variety of ways, a revocable trust or irrevocable trust. You can get all that information from any funeral service provider. Now, I'm not saying you should do this, but you should be aware of this option because basically you work with an organization, you identify the services that you want to purchase, you pay in advance, so you've locked in the price. So it's a hedge against inflation. So it's like any other investment. You need to balance the pros and the cons of that investment and work with a reputable company. But I've talked to many a family, and once they've done this, it just gave them some peace of mind, knowing that that part of the plan had been taken care of. Now, there are other sources to fund funeral expenses as well, perhaps a life insurance policy that you have. Make sure your family knows that you have it, number one, and then number two, how to file for it. They have documentation They know the company that you purchased it through. And if you are a veteran, remind your family there are VA benefits for burial. Does not include the price of a casket, but there are some other benefits that they need to avail themselves of. So we've talked a lot about the importance of ritual, the nature of ritual, why end-of-life rituals are important, and then some options to consider as far as incorporating into your final act. So now let's conclude by considering how can we create a meaningful final act for those that are left behind? And how do we write a final act that provides healing connections for those we love the most? Well, this is where I encourage you to be creative. Don't craft something you think you should or you ought to do. Be creative. Allow yourself the freedom to create something that is reflective of who you are and the life that you've lived. And I want to give you two ideas, perhaps, that you hadn't considered. And one is not reinventing the wheel, but adapting ancient rituals that you're familiar with that are meaningful to you, but you need to tweak them just a little bit to personalize them. This is a phenomenal resource. Ancient rituals can be rediscovered and revitalized as we make them our own with our own meaningful symbols and maybe a little bit of a different spin on the process. And I want to give you an example of how this can work. Now, this is not related to an end-of-life ritual, but it's a ritual that was created to help a woman named Heather deal with a very difficult time in her life. I heard of Heather probably 20 years ago now. And at the time, she was 32 years of age, and she had just been diagnosed with a glioblastoma, a brain tumor. It was stage 4 and deemed to be terminal. And this kind of cancer is typically fatal in less than a year. Now, her story is just amazing, and I would not be surprised if I tear up because I always do in sharing this, but she was 32 and she had 2 small children at the time. One was 3 and one was 5. And she was determined to see them grow into adolescence. And so she got on the internet. She wasn't going to listen to her doctors who were so fatalistic. And she found a trial in the UK, an experimental drug that was being used for this particular kind of cancer. And so she enrolled in that trial, and she was talking to those doctors, and they said, "We're going to be honest with you. This regimen is brutal, and you will think it's going to kill you. The side effects are horrendous." And she said, "I'm willing to do it because I want to see my kids grow up." And they said, "We only have probably a 5% chance of success." She said, "Well, that's better than nothing." And so she took a chemo regimen every 3 weeks for a year, and she was brutalized by it physically, emotionally, psychosocially. Now, whenever she took her drugs, she would be violently ill for about 3 or 4 days afterwards. So her sister would come and stay with her to take care of the kids. And about 5 or 6 months into this journey, her sister was there caring for her, and she'd just put the kids to bed, and she was walking back down the hall, and she peeped into the bedroom to check on her sister, Heather. She wasn't in her bed. So she glanced over at the bathroom, and the door was cracked, and her sister was on the floor. So she dashed across the bedroom, blew through the door to find her sister kneeling in front of the bathroom counter. And she said, "Oh my gosh, I thought you'd fallen or fainted. You scared me to death." And Heather looked up and said, "No, I'm just doing my ritual." And the sister said, "What?" So Heather said, "Kneel with me and I'll explain this to you." And on the counter, there was a bottle of water and 2 vials of pills. And she said, "I don't know if you realize this," but she said, "about 2 months into this journey, I thought I was going to die. I just couldn't do this anymore. It's just too hard." And there was one night I was standing here in the bathroom trying to force myself to take these drugs, and I just couldn't do it because I knew what was going to happen. And then I recognized that those drugs are the only hope I have to live. And I'm fighting them. I'm resisting them. So I told myself, change your attitude, have a different process of taking these drugs. And she said, then it dawned on me. I view this as a different kind of communion. And Heather looked at her sister and said, you know how I love the Eucharist. You know how I love to take the wine and the bread, the body and the blood of Christ. And I view that as life-giving and life-saving. She said, so that's what I do with the water and the pills now. And that's how I get through this. When I heard that story, I just was overwhelmed by her courage and also her creativity. Yes, it was a different kind of communion, but it served the same purpose. She had different symbols that she utilized. She had different elements. But the water to her, when she looked at it, it was the wine. And the pills, when she looked at it, became the bread. And in that moment, those were life-giving elements because she enacted the same process. The process she had known and loved her entire life. She could do it with her eyes closed. So it gave her a sense of certainty and continuity, and it gave her courage. And a connection was made in that moment for her. She connected to her sense of the sacred and the divine. She recognized she was not alone in her bathroom when she was taking those chemotherapy drugs. And meaning was created. That was not a futile process for her. There was a purpose. That purpose was life, to live. And so her fear was transformed to hope, and she healed. Now, I don't mean physical healing. I'm talking about a sense of wholeness. Now, whenever I share this story, people always ask me, so what happened to Heather? Well, interestingly enough, at the end of this 1-year regimen, she went in for a brain scan. And miraculous as it sounds, there was no evidence of her tumor after 1 year. And she went on for the next 10 years to be an advocate for families who were dealing with brain cancer. And she served them so incredibly well, so compassionately, until she had a recurrence of brain cancer. And she fought that battle for 2 years until she died. But she lived to see her kids move into adolescence. And that's what she committed to do. And she accomplished that by taking a ritual that had spoken to her the entirety of her life, changed it just a little bit, and it served her well during a very dark and daunting moment. We can do that with end-of-life rituals too. We don't have to start from scratch. We can retrofit. We can customize. Now, another idea in crafting, creating, and conducting ritual, I think a doggone good idea, is the creative collaborative approach. So as you are contemplating all these questions and you are starting to craft your script, be collaborative. Invite people that will actually be conducting this ritual to be part of the process. So invite others to be part of your cast and crew. Maybe even invite them to assume a particular role in your final act. Share creative ideas with them. Bounce ideas around. Chew them over. Debate them. Discuss them. And listen to what people have to say. Because they may have an idea, a process to interject that would be tremendously beneficial for them as they are grieving and mourning your death. So encourage that heartfelt reflection collectively and weave tales into the ritual. No doubt if you're having this conversation with family and friends that know you well, stories are going to bubble up and they're going to say, oh, well, we have to remember when. And so write that down so that story is not forgotten, not lost in the shuffle. So share that planning experience. It's informative for everyone because perhaps it will motivate them to do their own planning process. So be open to the possibilities, be open to different ideas, and remember any action can be a ritual that serves to connect, that can ultimately serve to heal. Your final act benefits those that you leave behind. How you choose to exit, it matters. And as a writer, I know that endings matter to every narrative. So be intentional about this. Craft a healing moment. Your final act. It's a guiding light for those you love. Now, I always have a closing ritual. Since I've been preaching about ritual for the last hour, I think it's only fitting. But I have one more thing for you to consider related to our topic today. Funerals, final acts, seem less about comforting the souls of these dearly departed than about comforting the people they leave behind. So yes, you are the main character in your final act, but it's not all about you. You are actually writing this script for those that you leave behind, the people that you love the most. And that is a priceless gift indeed. So a few resources for your consideration before we address your questions. If you're interested in other programs that I'm doing, feel free to check out my website, cardinallife.com. Click on the events tab and you'll see the fall listing. If you see a topic that tickles your curiosity, you can click on the link and register. I also have videos as well as podcasts posted on the website. If you're looking for a resource for caregiving, I wrote Caregiving for the Genius a few years ago. It's available in most libraries throughout Colorado, but you can certainly purchase a copy on Amazon. And if you do enjoy podcasts, I have Cardinal Musings with Jane Barton, and we talk about a variety of concerns related to aging as well as caregiving. And I hope you'll save the date for our next program here on October 11th from 11:30 to 1, The Conversation. We're going to talk about the importance of chatting with our family members and our clinicians about our preferences related to medical care at the end of life. So I want to thank you for your time and attention today. It's always my honor to share a little bit of the day with you. Know that I'm sending many blessings to you on your journey. And if I can ever be of help to you, don't hesitate to drop me an email, cardinallife@msn.com. I would be delighted to continue the conversation with you. So now, the best part of the program for me is to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to unshare my screen so I can see what's going on and see if there are any questions in the chat. Ginger, you're muted.
Oh, goodness gracious. Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.
No, I was just saying thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Jane. Those are really powerful stories and I think really comforting for all of us for a topic that's not always something that everyone wants to talk about. But the tools and skills that you gave in our presentation, I think would be really helpful to a lot of people. So I just want to encourage everybody to list your questions in the Q&A feature or in the chat feature. I'm going to also put in our chat, we have a survey on feedback for our presentation today. To get us started, I have a comment from Sue Schneider that's in the Q&A, and she just says, I just want to share how comforting this presentation has been. There have been so many things to take into consideration in advance of a death. There's nothing to be afraid of and everything to be gained by being thoughtful about the plans that can be made in advance. I love situating the conversation in the context of ritual.
Thank you, Sue. I appreciate your reflections and your heartfelt comments. I'm very honored by that.
Hey, and we do have a question here. What elements of a funeral or memorial service that you've been to resonated with you most?
Oh, wow. I've been to a lot of funerals, personally as well as professionally, but I have to say the thing that first bubbled up in my mind, there was a woman who I worked with. I was her spiritual director, and she had terminal cancer, and ultimately she died, and I was invited to her funeral, and I arrived, and it was standing room only in this huge sanctuary. She was a beloved woman. And she had, at the time, 4 living siblings. And they all were up at the front of the church, and they conducted a ritual unlike anything I've seen at a funeral, because they were all so comfortable and confident and engaged in the moment. And they basically spent an hour in the front sharing stories about their sister. And it was a wonderful balance between celebrating a life and honoring the pain in the room, recognizing our sense of loss and sorrow. And for that hour, I don't know that I've ever laughed as much or cried as much. And that truly is, I think, a hallmark of ritual done well at the end of life. Because if we move too quickly to celebrate, we discount the pain that we're feeling. And if we get mired into the sorrow and the sadness, we can get stuck in our grief. And so the goal truly is, and the challenge to be confronted is, how do we balance that? How do we feel our sorrow, but celebrate the person we've loved to the point that we're motivated to go on? And so that was a profoundly important experience for me.
That's wonderful. And it really does acknowledge all of the feelings that go into it and honors all of the feelings that we feel when we go through grief periods. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how does your family deal with the topic of last rites?
When death strikes?
On the topic of last rites.
On last rites. Well, I'm the last one standing in my family, so I can tell you what happened previously. We were the poster family for let's not go there, let's not talk about it. And as I shared through some of my stories, that did not serve us well. So I learned my lessons. And now in my family of choice, which is my community of friends, we are very intentional. And part of that has to do with the fact that I'm aging solo. I'm not married, I'm not in a relationship, and I don't have kids. And so I need a community that I trust will enact my last rites in the manner that I would prefer and in a manner that will help them. So we have conversations that are ongoing, and oftentimes they're precipitated by what's happening in our lives. So if we have someone who's had a recent diagnosis, that brings everything front and center. We all feel a little bit more at risk. So we need to have that conversation. We need to gather and be that community to support each other. And so I think the biggest hurdle, and the first hurdle we have to cross in contemplating the end of life ritual, is our fear of death. And to acknowledge that we are all finite creatures. We are not guaranteed eternity. And so we need to come to grips with that so we can mitigate that fear and engage life more intentionally and plan for that ultimate reality that we're all going to die someday.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. I'd encourage everybody to maybe get their one last question in here if you have anything you'd like to ask Jane. While we give that a few seconds, I am going to put in the chat again our link to register for future webinars, as well as watch the recordings from previous if you've missed them. Okay, here we go. We've got one in from Sammy Stevens. Looks like she's got a comment. Jane, as an adult geriatric nurse practitioner, I have cared for many people at the end of life. In my experience, it is such a gift to family members and friends when the person dying has given some suggestions for end-of-life care and funeral planning. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Sammy. I'm glad to know there are geriatric nurses out there because you are few and far between. And the work that you are doing and the companioning that you offer is so needed right now. So I appreciate your presence in the world and certainly your reflections. So thanks for being here today.
Okay. Give it a few more seconds. I will also put in the chat again the list for the handout. I know if you come in a little later than when we've posted it, you miss it. So we'll stick that in there one more time so everybody should have that. Okay, it looks like that is the end of our questions for today. I just want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our team, and I would especially like to thank Jean Barton. She's been wonderful. We've been doing webinars with her since the spring, and we cannot wait for our next webinar next month on October 11th. So we hope to see you soon. Thanks and have a great day.
Blessings.